The Prison Boss Narcissist. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. As you know, I put a rich and varied number of individuals under the Tudor scope to make a determination as to, is this person a narcissist, to help you understand more about their behaviours and what it is that we see in those behaviours that marks them out as a narcissist. When it comes to those individuals that go under the Tudor scope, we of course have had some particularly violent men. David Carrick, the former police officer who engaged in repeated physical and sexual assaults of women. Chris Watts, of course, who murdered his family. Brian Laundrie, the individual that of course murdered his girlfriend. We have, of course, those more brusque and boastful narcissists such as Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, Prince Andrew, where we don't really hear about the abusive behaviours that go on behind the scenes. Yes, we've heard about Trump with his grab her by the pussy remarks, the allegations of sexual assault with regard to Prince Andrew, and of course Boris Johnson had an incident with his now wife where the police were called as a consequence of an argument that he was having with her. There are other narcissists that have a sour reputation, should we say, in terms of their conduct towards people. Ben Affleck, Kevin Spacey, with the various allegations made against him, Harvey Weinstein, who recently received yet more years to his sentence following a further conviction, Alec Baldwin, who's blown up in public, and Armie Hammer with his treatment of former girlfriends. When it comes to the women, we haven't had as many of examples of, if you would, the dynamic between a narcissist and a male victim where belittlement, physical violence has been used. There may be instances of those narcissists that have gone under the Tudor scope that are female that engage in such behaviours, but we haven't actually had it reported to the same extent. So, for example, with Gwyneth Paltrow, there's no doubt that she's a narcissist, but there haven't been any reported instances of her using physical violence. Ditto Ellen DeGeneres, ditto Taylor Swift, ditto Hilaria Baldwin. But we determine their narcissistic credentials from other aspects of their behaviour. With Harry's wife, of course, there's a suspicion that she has used violence behind the scenes, or at least verbal violence with regard to the way that she bullies people. With Chrissy Teigen, again, we have no evidence of physical violence, but verbal violence towards people on the internet. With Amber Heard, she, of course, was documented as being physically violent as well as verbally violent towards Johnny Depp. We have, though, in this example, an instance of a female narcissist behaving towards her husband, the intimate partner primary source, in a variety of ways which are manipulative, which also includes physical violence. Therefore provides an opportunity to understand a female narcissist using physical violence towards a victim. I'm referring to the case involving Sherry Spencer, who was just recently jailed for abusing her husband, Richard. There have been various reports about this across UK media. I'm taking the information here from the Mail Online, from Martin Robinson's article. An abusive wife and prison boss who beat her husband every day, physical violence, sustained course of conduct, while calling him a pussy, verbal insult, and made him clear up her own feces, belittlement, during a horrific 2-decade campaign of terror, grinned in the dock, absence of emotional empathy, absence of remorse, as she was jailed for 4 years. The abuse, which I'm going to go into some detail about in the course of this report, of course, occurred over 20 years, which shows a sustained course of action and a pathological type of behaviour. Mother of 3, Sherry Spencer, 45, was sentenced at Hull Crown Court for making her husband Richard's life a living hell with daily beatings, assertion of control through physical violence, and verbal attacks, insult, that left him cowering on the floor in a fetal position. On one occasion, she defecated on the floor and forced him to clean it up, belittlement, humiliation. And another, she beat him with a wine bottle so hard, physical violence, it permanently disfigured his ear. The assaults included kicking, punching, hitting, biting, and spitting at him. She also damaged his laptops, phones and clothes. Not only physical violence, but destruction of property, absence of boundary recognition. Jailing Spencer for 4 years, Judge Kate Rayfield told her that the abuse of Richard Spencer was the worst case of controlling and coercive behaviour I have seen. As well as a prison term, threat to control through incarceration, she was given an indefinite restraining order against her victim. Threat to control by virtue of restraining order, but still grinned, absence of emotional empathy, as she left the dock to be taken down to the cells. She worked at the highest levels for HM Prison and Probation Service and bragged, grandiosity, to friends that she had the ear of former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. It was described as a great irony that Spencer had done so much work aimed at investigating the effect of custodial sentences on the family. In furious wine-fueled tirades, she would call him dum-dum, insult, and cause bruises and scratches that he would need to cover up with makeup before going outside. For years, he secretly recorded video and audio of his wife's attacks on him, and when police became involved, he handed over 43 images of his bruised face, taken on different dates, following savage assaults he had suffered. Mr. Spencer, of course, doing the correct thing with regard to the accumulation of evidence. Mr. Spencer would email them to himself and delete them from his phone so his wife didn't realise he was recording her violent assaults. Hull Crown Court heard that Spencer was a mother of 3 young children and that many of the attacks on her husband had occurred in the family home. This shows a parental abrogation of her responsibilities and duties by engaging in violence towards her intimate partner primary source whilst children are in the home also. It shows a lack of emotional empathy for them, a lack of accountability for her behaviours. Spencer, of Upmarket Bubwith in East Yorkshire, was a project manager in the department's Directorate of Strategy and Performance. A former friend said she would brag, grandiosity, about being only 2 down from the Prime Minister in her field and had meetings with Boris Johnson, who she spoke of as if he was a friend. Magical thinking. She was bragging about her high-flying career while subjecting her poor husband, a lovely man, to daily abuse, degradation and humiliation. Contradictory behaviours. Within months of becoming a couple in 2000, Richard Spencer endured her violent rages, ignition of heated fury, devaluing behaviour, devaluation period, which happened whether she was drunk or sober. Mr. Spencer told the court that although he was bigger and physically stronger than his petite wife, he did not fight back when she began to attack him. This, of course, can be quite common with certain victims because they're just not simply geared up to respond to physical violence with physical violence. There's also the fact that notwithstanding the abuse that they are receiving, many still have emotional empathy for their attacker and can't bring themselves to fight back. He said he almost became immune to the physical abuse she meted out, even though she would cause him immense pain by sinking her teeth into him. But he said the mental scars left by 16 years of her hate-filled attacks were what would leave the most lasting effect. Spencer's reign of domestic terror finally ended in June 2021 when the police were called to their family home by a concerned welfare worker. Her arrest that day, on suspicion of assaulting her husband, opened a door into the hell he had kept private for his entire married life. He stood before the court today and at one point struggled to choke back tears as he described his nightmare marriage in a personal statement. Mr. Spencer said, "From September 2000 to June 2021, sustained period, Cherie subjected me to hundreds of physically, mentally and emotionally abusive episodes, perpetrated in a pattern of behaviour going back over 20 years, almost half my life." Notice that this devaluing behaviour during the sustained devaluation period includes not only a range of manipulations but also shows that he was neither moved to escape nor was she moved to disengage from him. The article continues, "I have become resigned to the fact that I will never fully recover from her abuse and that it will have a permanent damaging impact on mine and my family's life. Cherie's abuse towards me evolved and escalated over time. She used repeated acts of physical assault, threats, verbal abuse and humiliation to punish and exercise control over me. All of those, of course, are forms of an assertion of control and rudimentary manipulations. The abuse was hidden from the outside world, including friends and family, which demonstrates the use of a facade. Cherie manipulated me into believing that I was a responsible and willing participant in the abuse, blame-shifting and gaslighting. She remorselessly proclaimed that I deserved to be punished, and that it was a justifiable consequence of me disappointing her in some way. Little by little, I lost my independence and willpower, and just accepted that was how my life was going to be. I complied with Cherie's demands, and she controlled most aspects of my everyday life, including things like what activities I could participate in, and when, which room I could sleep in, and even which toilet I could use. Gradually, I became isolated from family and friends, use of isolation to assert control, and was left deep in debt, financial control, causing me to feel trapped. Mr. Spencer said that restraining his wife was his only hope of avoiding serious injury, but the act of holding her still provoked her wrath. Threat to control by him restraining her, amounting to ignition of fury. He told the court, I became increasingly hardened to the physical attacks that were usually inflicted when Cherie had been drinking alcohol, such as the kicking and the punching, although some things were particularly painful, such as biting and nipping. I'm physically bigger and stronger than Cherie, so I could restrain her if the pain became unbearable. However, I could only hold her for so long, and when the time came to let go, she would be even angrier, and the injuries she would inflict afterwards were always worse. After a while, I learnt to cover my face with my hands and curl up into a fetal position to try and avoid sustaining any visible facial injuries so that I could still take the children to school and nursery. The worst of the assaults occurred in April 2021 when his wife attacked him with an empty wine bottle. The court heard that Spencer beat him with the bottle all over his head and body, assault with weapon, but causing a serious injury to his ear, which swelled dramatically. Mr. Spencer said he needed hospital treatment, which his wife responded to by calling him a pussy. Lack of compassion, lack of emotional empathy, verbal insult. She looked up YouTube videos on how to drain blood from the ear by puncturing it with a knife. When he refused, she told him that if he used his name at the hospital, she would stop him coming back into the family home. Threat. She ordered him to use her brother's name, and he did as he was told as he was booked into A&E, fearing the reprisals that would happen if he did not. Richard Pratt, KC, defending, said there was little he could say to mitigate against Spencer's appalling treatment of her husband, and described her professional accomplishments as ironic. He said it was almost impossible to recognise her professional person as the same woman who subjected her husband to the shocking and distressing attacks, points to the use of a facade. Mr. Pratt said, it is perhaps particularly ironic that one of the projects she has been working on has been dealing with the effects of custodial sentences on the family. That is an irony. But what is important and significant is that she continued to work and has an excellent work reputation and record. He said that Spencer had suffered bouts of depression and anxiety throughout her life, which she had wrongly sought to self-medicate by drinking alcohol, blame-shifting, use of ill health as an excuse. The court was told that on some days she would drink as much as 3 bottles of wine. Judge Rayfield described how she had sat through 2 hours of video and audio recordings of Spencer hurling hateful abuse at her husband. She added, in one of these recordings it is clear you had defecated on the floor. Your husband can be heard scrubbing while you're heard to say to him, I made you do that. All I asked you to do was go to the shop. Blame shifting. I watched as you spat in his face time and time again and called him bitch, tiny cock and skank and insulted members of his family. Belittlement, humiliation, insult. You whispered in his face in the most sinister way, shouted demands and instructions at him, get the fucking chicken, get to the fucking shop, and warning him, you will learn. Threat. By your actions, you intended to humiliate or degrade Richard, and you have caused him significant psychological harm. Richard Spencer was a vulnerable victim, isolated from his family and trapped financially. Spencer admitted coercive and controlling behaviour and 3 counts of assault, occasioning actual bodily harm. The charges could only cover a 5-year period dating from the time the law on controlling and coercive behaviour was passed in late 2015. But Judge Rayfield said she took account of Spencer's persistent behaviour towards her husband because it cast light on his vulnerability as her victim. We are able to discern with regard to Cherie Spencer's behaviour that in a court of law and her guilty plea was that she accepts that she behaved in this fashion for a 20-year period of time, and therefore in the circumstances We have a range of behaviours which have occurred over a sustained period of time which point to them being pathological with regard to her personality that would support the fact that she's a narcissist. Also, in support of that, we see that she operates with a sense of entitlement. She would order Mr. Spencer around. She expected an immediate response. She demonstrates a lack of accountability. She's told lies. One would imagine that she would not provide much in the way of domestic help, causing him to have to do it, for instance, where it was stated about getting the chicken on and getting to the shop, etc. She would not have provided him with any emotional support. She would not have any genuine friends. She would not address their relationship issues in a constructive or meaningful fashion. One would gain the impression that she was someone who would never apologise. There's evidence of grandiosity. She thinks she's better than she actually is, engages in showmanship, brags about her perceived successes, and she's vain. One could imagine that she would also dominate conversation. There are clear haughty behaviours. She's rude, dismissive, arrogant, believes she's always right, and obnoxious. There is a sustained range of manipulative behaviours, which includes the telling of lies, triangulation with object, triangulation with person, physical violence, smearing, invalidation, belittlement, withdrawal, denial, guilt, provocation, projection, blame shifting, use of threat, control through finances, use of insult, heated fury, destruction of property, revision of history, shouting, argumentativeness, bullying, intimidation, deflection, false accusation, accusations out of nowhere, vagueness, and use of ill health. There are issues with regard to boundary recognition as a consequence of asset appropriation and a lack of privacy. She shows aspects, of course, of the narcissistic dynamic. From the information given, facade management, treats others as an extension of self. Black and white thinking, the exhibition of the need to assert control, the exhibition of a response to a perceived threat to that control. Hypocrisy, objectification, compartmentalization, paranoia, competitiveness, superficiality. It's also evidence that there is a lack of emotional empathy occasioned by the way that she has treated him as a whole, her manipulative behaviours, and also the way that she has abused her children's father, therefore having no due regard for how that impacts upon them. So there is a wide range of narcissistic indicators over a sustained period of time that would easily get her over the threshold to be found to be a narcissist. If you're interested in what school and cadre she would be, then join me in the complementing video where I ascertain that. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.